So I'm going to go through the key features of the political, economic, and social um, aspects of the Soviet Union. It's a big part of your dictatorship or democracy course. Don't forget that the announcement that was made um, in the second week of September 2022 states that students who sit the Leaving Cert in 2023 can write answers in response to two questions from the same section. So that means that if dictatorship democracy is something that you have done with your teachers, then you could be able to answer two questions from that section. So, for example, there might be a question on popular culture. So that's your Bing Crosby, Charlie Chaplin, Leni Riefenstahl, and even Joseph Goebbels can come into that depending on the wording of the question, that essay, which you can prepare by looking at your key personalities. But then there might be also an essay on Stalinist Russia or the purges. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. Okay, so USSR, we know that's what Russia was known as between. I think it officially became the USSR in 1922, could be 1923, but essentially since the Soviet Union, since the Russian Revolution, and when these different regions called Soviets were united together under the Bolshevik communist leadership, USSR, we're looking at that from the early 1920s through to 1945 in this little video. So what do we know? Oh, by the way, if you're somebody who's watching this and you don't have these mind maps because you're not in my history class, you can I can sort you out with copies of these mind maps if you send me an email at pmcbrunner@icloud.com. pmcbrunner@icloud.com. I have loads of them, and if you send me an email, I'll let you know how much they cost, and I can forward them into a PDF. Okay, I've got them for most areas of the course. Anyway, so what do we know? We know that in 1917, Lenin, who was the leader of the communists, communists are people who believe that all wealth should be equally distributed amongst the people. Lenin successfully led the communist or Bolshevik group in the October 1917 revolution. Okay, the Bolsheviks were it's a Russian word that is derived from it's a Russian word that related to a small group of communists who were in the minority, well, obviously they're in the minority, against the Mensheviks. It's not important, you don't need to know, but all you need to know is that when you hear the word Bolshevik, you mean communist. And when you say Bolshevik, you mean those communists that were led by Lenin, who had the insurrection in 1917 that nobody expected to be successful because of a number of factors, including the Russian disenchantment with the involvement in the First World War and German agitation in Russia, were successful. Okay, so what do we know? In 1917, Russia was an empire. Its leader was an autocrat. That's an absolute monarch called Tsar Nicholas II. And Tsar Nicholas was overthrown in the 1917 revolution. He was eventually executed by the Bolsheviks. And between 1917 and 1921, there was a civil war in the country that we today call Russia, between the Bolshevik supporters, those who were known as the Reds, and this kind of hodgepodge coalition of different groups who were opposed to the Reds. So, I mean, amongst those people were Tsarists, old style supporters of autocracy. But there were also people who were Democrats and didn't like what the communists stood for, people who were socialists and opposed to the extremism of communism. But there was a huge and ethnic minorities who saw the signs of what might come under communist leadership. Long story short, the civil war went on between the Reds and the Whites for a number of years, and the leading Bolsheviks at the time were Leon Trotsky, Zinoviev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin. These were important Bolsheviks during the early years, and Trotsky was really important in the Red victory in the Civil War. Again, I don't expect you to ever have to write an essay on why the Bolsheviks won the Civil War, but if you looked at it in your class, you'll know about interior lines of communication, you know about a disorganized opposition, poor generalship on the white side, and Trotsky's dynamic leadership on the red side. Those factors, not trying to simplify things too much, those factors resulted in the successful defense of the revolution during the Civil War. So by 1921, the Reds, the communists, the Bolsheviks have control of what used to be the Russian Empire. Okay? And when they took over, it's very important that you understand that the Bolsheviks stood for certain things. First of all, they were completely opposed to democracy. Now, I often find the students are a little bit confused because to differentiate between fascism, the kind of one of the big extreme ideologies of the 20th century, and communism, the other big one. And of course, they had a lot in common. Both of them were opposed to democracy. Both of them were opposed to democracy because they felt that democracy made the country weak and their goal was to make the country strong. Both communism and fascism propagated the idea of a great leader. Now, communism in its ideology did not propagate this, but in reality, that's what happened. In its ideology, communism was about government by the people. But essentially, when you have a one-party state, and communists believed they were anti-democratic, so there should be only one party, then obviously the leader of that party was going to be the most powerful person in the country, and that is what leads to dictatorship. Communists wanted their party, their ideology, to have total power over the government of the state. There should be no other voices. There should be no political dissent. That there should be no opposition to what they're doing because they believed that they were doing what was right. And a government which is intolerant of any opposition and wants to have total power over the people and over the state is called a totalitarian government. And the Soviet Union was certainly a totalitarian state. Okay, very important term for you to know. Now, Stalin was not one of the rock stars of the Bolshevik Revolution. So we know he becomes, the most significant figure in Russian history and arguably one of the most significant figures in world history in the 20th century. And he begins as a kind of a low-level Bolshevik operative. He had a long backstory involved in revolutionary activities all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. And his name, by the way, was Joseph Juglashvili. He was born in Georgia, which was a state controlled by the Russian Empire. But he obviously was on the run as a revolutionary during the Tsarist times. He operated under a number of code names, one of which was Koba, but the main one was Stalin. So he became known as Joseph Stalin. And he was General Secretary of the Communist Party. Now, this was not a glamorous job. This was not a job that many people wanted. But what happened was he rose to a position of power because the General Secretary essentially allocated the jobs within the party. Now, the party ran the country. So if you were allocating the jobs, if you were picking this guy to do that job and that guy to do this job, well, then those guys owed you favors. Those guys were indebted to you for their position and their power. So Stalin was not and this I'm talking about in the early 1920s when, Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Lenin, when these were the faces of the revolution. Stalin was not well known, but he was gathering power throughout the early 1920s because these functionaries of the state owed a debt to him for their job. The main kind of personality, other than Lenin, of course, in the Communist Party in the early years was Leon Trotsky. And Trotsky, as I said, was the war hero. He was the guy that was regarded as being responsible for the victory in the Civil War. And so when people looked at the succession, like who would take over the leadership of the country when Lenin died, who would continue the revolution, who would protect, what's been won with so much sacrifice, the natural successor appeared to be Trotsky. However, not everybody supported Trotsky. And when Lenin passed away in 1924, unexpectedly, he was a young guy. He was, well, when I say young, if you're my age, you think he's young. He was in his 50s. There was no clear anointment of the next leader. But Lenin did leave a document known as his Last Testament, in which he specifically stated that he didn't think Stalin should take over as leader because he feared Stalin. He didn't think he would be a good choice because he felt that Stalin had tendencies that would be damaging, if for want of a better term, to the revolution and to the country. But Stalin suppressed that document, used his power and influence in the party to mitigate or to reduce the impact of that document when it was published by Lenin's wife, and then sold an image of himself as being Lenin's close confidant. Lenin was the Jesus figure of the cult of Bolshevism. So when he died, you didn't say anything against Lenin. And therefore, to promote yourself as being close to Lenin was to garner popular support. So Stalin was very, very clever. He knew that Lenin was very popular. So when Lenin passed away, he sold a myth to the Russian people that his relationship with Lenin was very, very, very close. That was not a lie. It was factually inaccurate, but that was how Stalin operated. He manipulated the facts in order to gain power. Now, when it came to the struggle for leadership between Stalin and Trotsky, really, again, I'm trying to simplify things down. What we have to understand is that Stalin had a very different view of how to go forward in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. His theory was I suppose, captured in the catchphrase, socialism in one country. And that essentially means, look, we've had a revolution, we've had years of civil war, the economy is broken, we need to take some time to strengthen, to reap the rewards of revolution, to make it worthwhile. And we need to concentrate on Russia, on the Soviet Union, on the USSR, before we start thinking about spreading communism. Now, Trotsky, he was different. So he was a really ardent follower of the founders of communism. That's Karl Marx and Joseph Engels, two 19th century philosophers who could not have imagined that their thoughts would have resulted in 20th century communism, I'm sure. But Trotsky looked at the message of Marx and Engels, and he said, no, we need to support permanent revolution. We need to spread this. This won't work in one country. What we've got to do is we've got to spread the revolution. So go into Germany, go into Britain, go into France, agitate the workers, support a revolution. And what that basically meant was keep war, permanent revolution. Now, for people who had been through the First World War, which was utterly disastrous for Russia, and then before that war was even over, were thrown into this unbelievably brutal revolution and civil war, which resulted in the deaths of millions. For those people to be told, no, we got to keep on fighting, we got to keep on sacrificing because we need to spread the dream of revolution, that was not a popular philosophy. So the sympathy for Trotsky began to dissipate due to his fixation on permanent revolution, and Stalin very cleverly used his message of socialism in one country, staying away from warfare and conflict for a while to try and build strength. He successfully sold that to the membership of the party, along with, of course, his underhanded techniques to garner support. So when it came down to it, when the power struggle for control of the party happened between Stalin and Trotsky after Lenin's death, Stalin won. Trotsky was out. He didn't have the support amongst the party members that Stalin had. He didn't understand Stalin's power that came about as from his position as General Secretary of the party. And also, Stalin had that advantage over him. If you support Trotsky, it's war, war, war. If you support me, I'm going to make the Soviet Union the socialist republic and, that we've always dreamed of. Okay? So I think that's really important. I'm not going to go too much further. I'll do a second part of this video. Maybe tomorrow I'll throw a second video up, okay? But what we have to do is we have to get then into, so that's kind of stage one of what you need to know about the Soviet Union. I haven't mentioned war communism, I know. I haven't mentioned a number of things that are important. But really, when you're studying the Soviet Union, you've got to get into the 1930s, because the case study is all about the purges and the show trials. And then there are certain things to do with the state, what it would be like living in a totalitarian state that you need to know. Because that's an essay you could be asked about, where you compare living in the Soviet Union to living in Nazi Germany, okay? So what do we know? We know that this, I'm just going to finish this page. There's another page, I'll do another video on that. We know that in the Soviet Union there was a secret police which went through a number of different names, okay? The Cheka and the KGB and the NKVD. But we're going to just talk about the NKVD, where, if you like, in broad terms, the Soviet equivalent of the German Gestapo. Okay, so they were the secret police, the guys who came knocking on your door at night time, pulled you out. Okay, in the 1930s, the boss of the secret police was a guy called Yagoda, and he had a network of informers all over the Soviet Union, including children who were encouraged to inform on their parents and their teachers if they were seen to be anti-revolution. And that resulted in a culture of communal paranoia, which basically meant that everybody was afraid of being, told on. Because if Yagoda's guys, if the NKVD came and took you out of your home, in the middle of the night, there was no due process, there was no trial, there was no, defense attorney or, lawyer standing up in court defending you. You disappeared. You went into the Gulag system, which were these prison camps that were spread all over northern Russia. Russia's an enormous, biggest country in the world, enormous country, into the frozen north. Or you simply got a bullet in the back of the head having been, mistreated or even tortured in one of these NKVD prisons. So people were afraid of the NKVD, and the NKVD were used to protect the communist parties, and particularly Stalin's position of power in the Soviet Union. Very important as well to understand that these totalitarian regimes understood the importance of influencing children. And in the Soviet Union, school children were subjected to what some students, when they write, they call it brainwashing. I prefer if you didn't use that word, brainwashing. The word I think you need to use is the word indoctrination. Sorry. No. So to indoctrinate means to influence, to powerfully influence the way a person thinks. So the Soviet school system was set up to sell the message that Stalin and the communists wanted them to, wanted children to buy. And of course, the Jesuit, I'll paraphrase, but they said, give me the boy of 5, I'll give you the man for life. So the idea was that young people in school, they were taught communist ideology. They were taught to view Stalin as someone that they had to show undying and unquestioned loyalty to. They were encouraged to join youth organizations, kind of equivalent to the German League of German Maidens and the Hitler Youth, called the Komsomol. There was no gender differentiation in the Soviet Union. That was uncommunist to do that. And where they were subjected to more propaganda. Every film they went to see in the cinema was created to propagate or to further the communist message, and to create paranoia about, agents working to destroy the revolution. Every newspaper was censored. Every newspaper contained propaganda. There was radio, but radio was very, very tightly controlled and was always on message. And there were things like Stakhanovism. And Stakhanovism, again, you should look it up, lads, but Stakhanovism was a really, 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 if you want to give an example of the Soviet propaganda machine, this is a great example. So Stakhanov famously was this miner who was supposed to have dug out, incredible amounts of coal, in pursuit of serving the country. He was then, his feats were publicized, and everybody was urged to follow the example of Stakhanov. Sacrifice yourself, work harder for, suffer now in order to create a better future. And that he was brought around to all of the different Soviet states, and he was there were films made about him. He became a film star himself. There were posters promoting Stakhanovism, that idea of sacrifice for the state, everywhere. And of course, it was a version of the truth that had very little to do with the actual truth. And if you're interested, by the way, the story of Stakhanov would be a great topic for, well, I don't know whether, could you do it as an RSR? I'd say you could, because it's part of the course, but it's not a major part of the course. Okay, so that's the end of that video 1 on the Soviet Union. And tomorrow we get into the purges, or not tomorrow, the next video, we'll get into the purges and how Stalin used terror to control the Soviet Union and to implement his policies, economic, social and political.